everybody here in the room and online. My name is Machtel Oosterkamp and I'm a library staff member of the African Studies Center. Mari Ditmars and me organized a series of activities around the UNESCO World Philosophy Day. Okay. Last week we had a seminar When Africans Speak. And today we have African philosophy book promotions. Next week on the 20th of November, there will be the public lecture by Professor Olatunji Olesile, who is here present today. You can still register for that online. I think today is the last day you can actually register. On the 20th of November, no, the 25th of November, we will have a film screening in the Lipsius building. I Am Not a Witch, which will be introduced by Louise Muller, and we will have an after talk and questions and answers. You need to register for this as well, and you can do that through our website. The final activity is on 4th of December, the Stephen Ellis debate on the role of African philosophy in peace and security with keynote speaker Pasca Mungwini and reflections by John Kegel, Angela Roodhaan and Irma Specht. Besides these events, the library has produced a web dossier on African philosophy, which you can find on our website. And it has, it's kind of a bibliography on this topic. Today we will discuss two books by Afrikaanse filosofie by Pius Mosima and Henk Haenen, and African philosophy and the politics of food systems by Wilfried Bogaert and co-authors, and Professor Olesile will discuss this with her. Yeah, so this is the program for today. First book will be the Afrikaanse filosofie. And then in the break, there is the possibility of a library tour, which my colleague will be honored, my colleague Pepler Head will be honored to show you the new library. Today's moderator is Pius Mosima. He's lecturer of philosophy, and I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Machtel, for those kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished scholars, former students, this is a very wonderful day. I'm highly elated to be here with my co-author, Henk Haenen, to talk about this book, Afrikaanse filosofie, Stemmen van Wijsheid. African philosophy in English, Voices of Wisdom, ou en français, la philosophie africaine, la voix de la sagesse. We have been doing this book for the past 2 or 3 years, Henk and we thought it wise to bring philosophy to a broader audience, to everyone, not just for those in the academic class, but make African philosophy known to everybody and make sure that they understand what African philosophy is all about. And so we have just 20 minutes, and so Henk, we're going to go faster than we had expected.
What's lower than this?
Okay, so this is a background, a brief background to this book. I know you are going to ask, how come a Cameroonian is writing a book on African philosophy with a Dutchman, which I'll get to that answer later on. But when we started talking about this book, we went to the dunes. Yeah, and Henk, yes, tell us about the dunes. If you come from
Yes. The dunes is, of course, an environment of nature. And our view on philosophy, African philosophy, in intercultural perspective, is very related to the interconnection between person, society, and nature. And that's because we have this picture to stress on that. And the sea of thoughts and values in the background of it is, of course, important for our journey of philosophizing. And journey is going on the move. And so there was a sea of thoughts and values important for African and Western philosophy.
Okay, thank you, Henk. Now, but this philosophical journey started some 9-10 years ago after my PhD at Tilburg University, precisely on the 16th of February 2016. The next morning, I was invited to give a workshop at the Radboud Universiteit in Nijmegen about Placid temples and Bantu philosophy. So when I got to the hall, I was talking. There were a host of listeners, but there was one guy who kept smiling when I was talking. I was talking and he was just smiling, nodding, affirming what I was saying. I said, but who is this guy? So after the talk, he walked up to me, and that's where we started the whole issue of an African philosopher. And when we got there, I realized that Henk had a PhD in sage philosophy 10 years before me, and he had done African philosophy in this country. So this encounter gave us a wonderful starting point for this book today.
Yes, aha-erlebnis, just Freud is saying. And then you are at the moment now in one flesh on the common ground. Yes?
Good. So but Henk, precisely, your PhD was in sage philosophy, I guess.
No, but I've worked out one chapter of my PhD in the meaning and the ongoing meaning of the philosophy of Henry of the Oruka as an icon, but also as a challenge to go further.
Okay, so yeah. What cuts across and what you find in this book is the whole idea of an intercultural encounter. Beyond Africa, beyond Europe, this encounter, this friction, this movement has helped us a lot in writing this book. And so you find here Placid temples and Henry Odera Oruka.
Yeah.
Now, here you have the map of Africa. And throughout this book, African Philosophy, Voices of Wisdom, we think African philosophy has a restorative power. What do you mean by restorative power?
Oh, there's so much injustice in history and the power balances of economic areas, of scientific areas, and there must be a restorative power to have a new side, a new way of valuing the power relations and to turn it to more balance.
Very good. So you can see the map of Africa. I actually come from Cameroon, you see where we are around Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria. That's where I come from. Professor Yeshile is just my neighbor. Some years ago, I met him in Ibadan, University of Ibadan. He hosted me for almost a week. And so much of what we are talking as African philosophy is located at sub-Saharan Africa. We get down as far as South Africa is concerned. And so, something interesting, but why this subtitle, African Philosophy, Voices of Wisdom? Why are we talking about voices? Why a voice?
Because to honor the African traditions of oral history, and there is a source full of reasoning, logical reasoning, and to recognize and to honor that, we have chosen for voices, and also philosophizing at the beginning of speaking, and speaking, discussion, and so on. And then there can be reflection on the written, and the written can be a possibility to discussions further, but also the speaking men and women are in the foreground.
Yeah, but Henk, you remember when we were talking about this book, at one point, I tried to give it a very much post-colonial or decolonial tone, that the African voices had been suppressed for so long.
Yeah.
And so when I proposed this subtitle, we said, oh, Pius, this is really good.
Yeah.
And there are many voices we find around here, but symbolically, I used a voice. I used to, you know the voice I always use, that my colleagues here from Nigerian University know, the voice of the drum.
Drum, yeah.
And Birgit and Wagen, the voice of the drum.
Yeah.
We at one point, the drum became a symbol of restoration.
Yeah.
The drum gave us this new African touch, but in a different place, in either Wageningen or in Leiden.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but why would you insist that the voices of African philosophy would be much more appropriate than just kind of an African philosophy or whatever?
The voices of traditional wisdom, that's a reflection on experience with logical reasoning. And so it is very important to hear and to listen to these voices, because there's a domination, has been domination in a scientific and philosophical way to Western scopes, Western references. So there must be an openness to that. And the voices and the drums have the rhythms to invite to that openness.
There's a whole chapter on drums.
Yeah,
I think we speak a lot about Senghor and African music, African art.
Yeah.
But Henk, are you sure your voice is not dominating my voice at this presentation?
No. I ask you to have the leading part of the whole, and the leading part as a reflection of our dialogues. So I think you are joking at the moment now.
Okay, so because of time, like I mentioned, this element of decolonization came up and we talked about it very often. And we thought it's very important because various colonial masters came to Africa. The British came with indirect rule, the French avec assimilation, the Portuguese with paternalism, and each had its own particular touch on Africa. So we thought it wise to decolonize African thinking. And so in the book, you'll find we have discussed scholars like Kwasi Wiredu, Kwame Nkrumah, Cabral, but there is this very interesting touch by Olufemi Taiwo against decolonization. And I think that gives us a good touch, moving from the decolonial to the intercultural. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think this is an important move, an important transformation, but it is not this either or, it is and. The topic and scope of decolonization is, and in future will be important, but you must not let fix you in that. It is important because decolonization, and give attention to the word, decolonization is a reaction. And it is important to go from the reaction to action, from the self-consciousness that there are very rich principles, authentic from the African traditional cultures. And that bringing to the fore, that's not either or, but and, both. Both are important.
So,
decolonization, but also going aside of that reference and to speak from your self-consciousness of your culture and your traditions itself.
Henk, we have talked a lot about this issue of decolonization, and we mentioned Pauline Huntonji in his book, African Philosophy, Myth and Reality. But why not myth or reality?
Because there's an invitation to search for new methods to take serious the myths. Because the critics of Ntonchu has been focused on the methods to present African philosophy, and not, he is very open to accept the importance of African traditions, but the way of searching and presentation must be along good, well-known methodological principles, and not, like some amateurism that has been the case with Temple's interpretation.
Okay. So, I think if we have to move on with this discussion, I think if we remain enmeshed with decolonial theories, decolonial methods, and we stay so Afrocentric, we may not have the opportunity to dialogue, and have this productive tension between Africa and the rest of the world. Do you think so?
Yes. It is, of course, Africanism is a way of closing a circle. For instance, the symbol of Indaba. That is not a closed circle. That's a circle with openness. And that's important, the openness, but also a circle, because you have to meet each other with the same backgrounds, but you must at the same time invite the men and women with other cultural backgrounds, other interests. So the symbol of Indaba is very important for this.
So in Indaba is all around, it's about debates, about discussions, this journey.
And openness.
And openness. And so these can lead us to an intercultural perspective. Yeah. It's a starting point. But why are we using the word comparative at one point in the book? The word comparative philosophy comes from the word intercultural philosophy. Are there any distinctions we can make?
Yes. Because the relation between the individual and society, there's another starting point. From the West is starting point, always, most times, the individual, and then going to the relations with society. But from the African perspective, it's just from the society to the individual, and maybe it is better to say to the person, because the individual is not the same term as the person. We have discussed about that.
Sure.
Please, can you explain a little bit the difference between the individual and the person?
Yeah, in the Western world, in the Western world, we talk of the cogito ergo sum. It is the I think, therefore I am. It is the reverse in Africa. It is I am because we are, since we are, therefore I am. A person is a person through other persons. So to get into this society, it takes what we call an ontological progression. It is steps. When you get, glued with those rituals in society, that makes you to become a real motto, to become a real person. Now, but Henk, time is this intercultural space. What makes meaning for us? I mean, what sense do we make of this new intercultural space? What is the inter?
The inter, that's the discussion and the way of listening to each other, so that a multicultural society can transform to intercultural society. And that's not only a difference in words, but a difference in scopes. A difference to scope to the she and we, the they and we, we are all familiar to. There's a need to re-evaluation, and so there are differences, of course, but they are to overcome as obstacles. And so the intercultural perspective is heart of our philosophizing.
All right. And one of the major starting points for intercultural philosophizing is what we have discussed in length, the whole idea of an ethno-philosophy, the philosophy, a cultural philosophy, the philosophy of an ethnic group, or we have discussed at length as well about sage philosophy and about consensus democracy, as we found in many traditional African societies. And we have said the argument between the ethno-philosophers and the so-called professional philosophers has been hinging around power relations, about the philosophy being a particularized thing or a modernist thing. But Henk, because of time, I would like you to, could you tell us how our conception of African philosophy could help as far as mental health is concerned? You know, hinging from, coming from, African, ontological principles.
Yes. The dominant approach of mental health care in the Western countries is to see the problems of the individual. And of course, from the individual, you see the surrounding relations with the families and so on. But from the African scope, you have go from the starting point to the extended family. And there's a sickness not only of the person, but of the extended family as a whole. And that's important because the interactions between the person and the family is a very, very important way for recovering, for being in the move of recovery. And it is important to recognize the worth and the practical use of rituals. And that is not in the scope of Western psychologists and psychiatrists. And the religious aspect of being there, of being healthy or not, that's an important aspect too. From we can learn from African philosophers that aspects to take it into scope. And so we have experienced with members and participants in mental health care that there was for them also a aha-erlebnis that the approach from the African scope can help to broaden and to deepen the analysis, diagnosis, and the approach for recovering medicine and talking and so on.
Yes, and the African approach, when someone is sick, when someone falls ill, it is not just you, the individual, who is sick. It is the whole community. Yeah. Community is sick. And so diagnosis is not something individual. Cure, restoration comes back to the community. And Henk, I think throughout this process of writing this book, I'm so happy you learned an African language. You try to learn, Akan, Kwame Jeje, for example, and these distinctions he makes, which we find in the book. Could you just tell us on how you can apply that to the Western conception of mental health care?
Yes. Jeje has a special vision on personhood. So he has the distinction, open distinction between the okra, and that's the heart, the soul, translation, and the okra is embedded in the experiences of Sunsum. And Sunsum has the meaning of, yes, maybe you can tell us the meaning, Sunsum, the meaning of spirituality. Yeah. And that is a form of interaction of the soul and the spiritual environment. And there is a ring around that, and that's Sunsum, that's the body, but not the body fragmented from the spirit and from the soul, but in interacting with it. So it is a dynamic concept of the human person. And it is related to the surroundings of the society, but also with nature.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in our conception of African personhood, we talk about this relationship between the individual, society, and all of nature. And we thought that the African conception of personhood could help other cultural orientations, especially, this notion of binary complementarity, this element of the link between humans and all of nature. And one of the authors who brought that forth is Sophie Oluwole. You remember in our book, we tried to go beyond mainstream African philosophy and integrate the category women. And one of those that came to our mind is Sophie Oluwole. And she talks a lot about binary complementarity, this link between, different so-called ontologically fixed entities.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember Professor Ramose has discussed a lot engaged a lot with Heinz Kimmel as well, and David Bohm. Could you give us, an interpretation of that again?
Yes. There's a dominant tradition in Western philosophy and science to see things, meaning and values in opposition. And it is from the African way of thinking and philosophy important to see that there's a complementarity, for instance, between life and death, between an individual and society, between a certain interpretation of truth and another interpretation of truth. So there is a complementarity, a dynamic between the oppositions. And so you can see between men and women, between the night and the day, between being healthy and being sick. So you have to see that in a dynamic interaction, and that's important because African philosophy has much to do with dynamics in relationships, and that the complementarity characteristic is very important to have a way to the heart of African philosophy.
Okay, so I think these are most of the ideas we have been discussing in this book. We have tried to navigate between all of them, and I think, in a nutshell, what makes African philosophy unique, distinct, is that it is embedded in our customs, in our cultural orientations, in our lived experiences, and even in this experience I'm having now, this experience, this adventure I'm having now, this meeting here, for example, and it is also very communal. It's not as individualistic or solipsistic as you find in this part of the world. And Henk, I want to say this has been an interesting endeavor, and I would like to end with this proverb. This proverb from South Africa: wisdom is like a baobab. No person alone can embrace it.
No.
Very, very important. Wisdom is like a baobab. No person alone can embrace it. That summarizes our vision of an African philosophy, and want to stress the importance of community, the importance of this communal life, solidarity, helping each one of us. And I'm so proud to hear that my Cameroonian fellow countryman, Professor Achille Mbembe, is talking a lot about solidarity. Will be here, I think, next week in Amsterdam to give us a talk. I think if I have time, I'll be there. So thank you very much. I think we have not taken our time. More than time. 3 minutes. Okay, you want to add something in 3 minutes?
Yes. In addition, you mentioned David Bohm. And David Bohm is a very important dialogue partner for Mogobe Ramose in his book, African Philosophy Through Ubuntu. And David Bohm has written very important books about dialogue and about another approach of reality in scientific way, but also in normally way of people between each other. And one of the famous books of him is Wholeness and the Implicate Order. And the idea that there is a wholeness of relationships between men and society and nature and with the past and the future, that scope on relatedness, interconnectedness, is typical for the philosophy of David Bohm. So they have found themselves, we have found ourselves with Uruka. So David Bohm and Ramose have found themselves on a common ground of philosophizing. And that's important because yes, David Bohm has seen that the dominant way of the analytical approach, just like Descartes, has the risk of fragmentizing in scope, to stress on the differences between people, also between the humankind and nature, and he has broken a lance for stressing on the interconnectedness and the in-between. And so it is important to see that there are very much possibilities to have a good and fruitful dialogue between African philosophy and Western philosophy.
Yeah. And I think this dialogue, this is what is happening now.
Yeah.
And we deliberately kept that book within the spirit of dialogue. And we didn't want to stay so Afrocentric or so Eurocentric. We're looking for this middle ground, for this new space where we can recreate, and readapt and bring African philosophy to the fore. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We are kind of philosophy there for quite some time now. And Birgit, I'm very proud to introduce you to this platform to present child of your level, the product of your endeavors. Give Birgit a big hand, please.
Thank you, Pius, for the beautiful words. And first of all, thank you to Magdal and Manny for organizing this, because it's so important that we create this space and attention for the field of African philosophy. So especially here at the African Study Center, I think it's really great that we have that attention here. And thanks to you for coming actually at this late hour of our afternoon, that you're still here. Thank you for your attention. So yeah, I will say a few words about this book, African Philosophy and the Politics of Food Systems. And as you can see, it was not an endeavor on my own. Some of the names you might know, and I do hope that if you are a little bit familiar with African philosophy, you know the name of Mogobe Ramose. It was already mentioned by Henk and Pius. So it's been a great honor to edit the book together with him. And then we have Yesiwas Ebabu Worku, who comes from, or works actually in Ethiopia, did his PhD on the right to food. Sally Diop, who was a former master's student in plant sciences in Wageningen, and then my colleague from the Knowledge, Technology, and Innovation Group in Wageningen, David Ludwig, who's a philosopher of science. What I will do is, in 3 very short parts, mini lecture, really short, to introduce this book, is first say a little bit about food systems. You come for African philosophy, and I cannot assume that all of you are familiar with the food system debate. So I'm going to say a little bit why a book on food systems, why is that relevant? And then of course bring it together in part 2 with African philosophy, and in part 3 giving you a more of a sneak preview of the book and of the outline. And then we are very grateful, as already mentioned, to have Prof. Oyeshile here. We are co-teaching in Wageningen together. We were teaching this morning. We have already been teaching for 3 hours, I think, on Yoruba philosophy. So if we are a bit tired, please bear with us, including the 2 ladies there who are the teacher team in Wageningen, Eva and Anna. But yeah, Prof. Oyeshile will give some food for thought, reflections on the book. He has had the privilege of reading the book before it had come out. So, food systems. Why do we actually look at food systems? And what is important to know is that over history, and especially after the Second World War, there has been an imposition of the agricultural modernization paradigm. So we see that farms across the globe had to move into specialization, scale enlargement, intensification, and industrialization of agriculture. This has been imposed on farmers across the globe, from the Netherlands to Latin America to also Africa and Asia. But over time, we are starting to realize, and we have been realizing over the past few decades, that this system is unsustainable. Food is not equally accessible, it's not equally distributed. Traditional agricultural practices are eroding, farmers are dispossessed from their land, there's economic exploitation of natural resources, unequal trade policies, environmental degradation, and the list is actually much longer. There's a bunch of literature on how unsustainable the current food system is. And that's, of course, also the domain in Wageningen that we are studying. What this means is we need to transform our food systems. We need to produce food differently in the world. And this is called food systems transformation. So with an academic definition, that means that we are looking for significant reconfigurations of the assemblage of food system activities, actors, outcomes, and relations, dynamics, to move away from the current globalized food or industrial system and move towards sustainable, resilient, and just models of production and consumption. So a food system is both the farmers who produce it, as well as those who process it, as well as those who consume it. Now, I want to move into a little example of what that means for the African continent, because such a transition is by no means an easy process. It's actually a highly political and contested process. It's full of controversies and different perspectives and positions, and we see that best in the example of the United Nations Food Systems Summit in 2021. Has anyone heard of this summit? No? Okay. So the United Nations is also concerned about food, and they organized a food systems summit where the goal was to push the world to transform our food systems in order to reach all the 17 SDGs, particularly focusing, of course, on hunger and malnutrition. What they did is they organized, well, what they call dialogues, and especially African countries were engaged in these dialogues because there was a strong focus on how food systems should be transformed so that Africa can, well, be fed or feed itself. So you see that 49 out of the 54 countries were engaged in these dialogues. What do we learn from that food system is the person who was leading this was actually the African lady Agnes Kalibata. And she was a special convoy for the UN and leading these dialogues. And she actually said, Africa has developed a clear continental vision on the challenges and solutions to building sustainable food systems. So she said that in that summit, we came together and we actually have a vision of how Africa can feed itself and the world. What we see in that particular vision is that it is leaning heavily on modernization of agriculture with a strong technocratic approach. And what that means is that the same people who have been in power in these food systems are still reproducing the same system. And that is concerning. And there is also another response on the other side, and that is the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, AFSA. And that is a network that pleads for agroecology, indigenous knowledge, and practices that relate to family farming in Africa. Now, AFSA says the future of African food systems must be in African hands. It's also an African voice, but it's a very different one than Kalibata is promoting. Because AFSA says this whole summit is a neo-colonial event that has been dominated by large agro-industrial multinationals and Western research institutes who impose their paradigm on the rest of the world. They decided to boycott the summit because the true African voices that they found important that were excluded. What we can take from this is that the debate about food systems are highly political. There is a lot at stake on who is producing food and who is involved in deciding where food systems are going. On the one hand, we still have an imposition of an industrial, intensive and commercial agriculture with a lot of financial interest. And on the other hand, there is a call for systems that enhance agroecology, that enhance food sovereignty, that build on indigenous knowledge. And there's a tension between the two. But when we critically look at the summit, then we see that crucial parts of the food systems have been untouched. And we already learned from Henk and Pius, and most of you will know how strong the colonial influence and effects still are on the continent. And precisely those colonial legacies that maintain and reinforce these unequal power balances, epistemic and financially, they are being reinforced through this vision that was promoted by Kalibata. So rather than daring to address what are the colonial legacies in our food systems, there was nothing mentioned on coloniality in our food systems. There was one person actually who gave a more critical view. There is the UN rapporteur on the right to food, Michael Fakri, and he said the UN summit appeared to be heavily skewed in favor of one type of approach to food system, namely market-based solutions. More concerningly, he noted that the right to food had not been at the heart of preparations and debates of this summit. The right to food is not only a fundamental human right, but why is it that Africa can produce so much food and there's still so much hunger? That's the question that we have to ask, and he was the one who was addressing that question. And that is actually where our research takes upon and where our book also comes in. We see food system transformation as an ethical political process. It needs to be collectively stewarded and nurtured and adapted in an adaptive and engaged and creative way. That means we want to include the voices on the African continent themselves, and especially the indigenous knowledge systems, and including as well the views of farmers. What that means is we need philosophical engagement around food systems. There have been so much published on food systems, and it has been so little philosophical. So food systems and philosophy has hardly been studied. A few of these studies exist, but it's largely Western and European food systems and philosophers. Interesting, if we look at academic debates on food system transformation, especially where and how it should move in Africa, it's global North institutes that dominate those debates again. And it's global North authors who publish about it. And then coming back to that colonial legacy, the African continent continues to suffer from historical, social, political forms of domination, primarily by the global North, including the imposition of a Eurocentric and capitalist food system. And this book starts from the position that we need to question this. Food systems need to be questioned on the ethical and epistemic grounds. And that's what we are doing in this book. And in order to do so, we turn to African philosophy. And why are we turning to African philosophy? Oh, that is because it provides, by history, the field itself and the African scholars, they provide arguments for justice when we talk about transformation. It challenges, the field challenges dominant discourses on development and modernization. The field also provides critical reflections, especially on the epistemic and ontological assumptions. And it can provide powerful visions for future food systems. So this is the more kind of introduction on why African philosophy is relevant. But if we zoom in, how are we then going to approach African philosophy? We already briefly learned today that African philosophy has different trends, different schools of thought, different approaches. How are we doing that in this book? We approach African philosophy in the line of the struggle for liberation. And therein, we follow Pascal Mwini, who will be here the speaker on December 4. In his book that I just saw in the library, so I don't have it here, but in his book, he describes African philosophy as the bearer of an emancipated mission that aims for the liberation of the continent socially, politically, economically, and otherwise. And that means we need to liberate food systems from the oppressive and dominant system. And there is also an urgent need, especially in food systems, for epistemic justice, because much of the knowledge is leaning on Western knowledge systems about food. What is interesting to know is that the concern to transform agriculture on the African continent is not new, of course, but also not per se new in African philosophy. If we look at African philosophy and we approach philosophy as a liberatory practice of forms of oppression, then we actually see, especially when we look into the more political philosophy, that food is as the center. The great liberators, Cabral, Nkrumah, Nyerere, Sankara, they were already mentioned, but they all mentioned the central role of agriculture in overcoming colonial and neo-colonial exploitation, mentioning that the country needs to feed itself. but how that should be done, they were thinking about that. We also briefly heard about Oruka, and Oruka identified several trends or schools of thought in African philosophy. This would then be more part of the political line, but we can also look at the contemporary academic philosophers. And what we see is if we look at the current debates in African philosophy, there are actually very few philosophers who pay attention to food and agriculture. It's not central. There is an exception, and I'm hopeful there is a change. This is a good one of African agrarian philosophy by Tosam that came out 2 years ago, and the current Our volume is published in the same series. And then also already, thank you for the introduction. It saves me a lot of repetition. We also learned about the more ethno-philosophical engagement in philosophy or sagacic philosophy, and especially with agriculture and food. There we find the importance of indigenous and local knowledge in producing food, but also in processing food. So there are some trends or schools of thought where we will find agriculture in African philosophy, but it's not being given a lot of attention. And we argue in this book that it actually should and deserves much more attention, because otherwise the continent is being confronted with a dominant system that is actually destructive to the continent and also the planet. So what we do is we place African philosophical perspectives at the basis of debates on food systems, because it's relevant for food systems. But at the same time, we put the debates of food and agriculture back at the center of African philosophy that have not gained as much attention as it deserves. How am I doing time-wise?
Halfway, I think.
Oh, okay. That's nice. Thanks.
Yeah, 40 minutes.
Okay, then so this was a super brief introduction of how we bring these two together, these two domains. But of course, it's interesting to give you a little bit of a teaser on the content of the book. So the book consists of 12 chapters. As I said, it's an edited volume. These are the editors, but we have invited many more people to contribute. So in total, there are lots of authors from different places across the continent who have contributed. In doing so, we want to do some justice to the diversity in terms of agricultural practice, in terms of knowledge that is there. And we aim for a more interdisciplinary approach, where we combine African philosophy with agricultural and social sciences. And of course, being an African philosophical book, it's theoretically informed, but because of its interdisciplinarity, we also have more empirically informed chapters. And what you see here connects back also to what we heard already about the oral traditions and the importance of proverbs. Throughout the book, practically all authors have been using proverbs to underpin their arguments. But we felt that only using the proverbs as a text would not be doing justice to the richness of the stories and the proverbs. So what we have done, we have selected several proverbs, and they've been translated into these beautiful illustrations, handmade. And so throughout the book, with each of the chapters, there is a handmade illustration to give a more of an artistic interpretation of the book content. I will now briefly mention how the book is set up and also each of the chapters. I'm not going to summarize all of the chapters because it's a sneak preview. You will see the illustrations and the proverbs appearing while I'm talking, but I'm not going to read out all the proverbs and explain why they are in there. I mean, you will find that in the book. But this is a very central one that is in one of Ramos's articles and also in the current book. The children of one family even share the head of a locust, which refer to how important it is that we in the world, when there is sufficient food to feed the entire world, we should be able to share and divide. And why is it that we don't do that? So this book is actually providing some critiques to the dominant food system and what kind of responses do we see? And it comes back again to the decolonial thought that we have heard before. There are different responses to this. We will find chapters that are what we call counter-hegemonic. They are critiquing the mainstream or the dominant, mainly Western-based food system based on an Africa perspective. But then we not only need to deconstruct, it's not only critiquing, the book is actually full of reconstructive insights, where we are restoring African epistemologies and ethics, and indigenous food system. And then, of course, it's also important that we have some intercultural chapters where we bring some Western and African epistemologies together. Looking for future food systems does not mean that we throw away Western science altogether, but that we're finding ways in what we call epistemic pluralism, where there's space for multiple epistemologies. For each of the three responses, I will mention the titles of the chapters that we have. So the counter-hegemonic responses, we find them in the chapter by Pascal Mwale and Rivas Kayanga, who are located in Zambia. No, Malawi, sorry. Where they do a philosophical investigation of the African agro-epistemicide. What they zoom in is on the seed systems. Once you dive into the world of seeds, you will recognize that a lot of the seeds have been imported from Europe or from America, which are like crossbreds produced, some of them in Wageningen produced or designed even, while the indigenous seeds themselves are no longer being used. And so this is a plea and a critique on how using these seed systems is actually leading to epistemicide, the killing of knowledge around indigenous seeds. And in order to have a diverse and sustainable food system, it's really important that we also have a diversity of seeds and crops. Yesevas, Ebabu Worku, and Morobo Ramose, they have a reflection and an article on the human right to food, where they specifically look on the situation in Ethiopia and have been analyzing policy regimes and practices. And I'm not going to explain all the conclusions already, but I can definitely recommend reading this in how complex it is, but also how challenging the role of a government is in feeding its people, and how some of the policies are actually counterproductive in doing that. Reconstructive insights, we have at least 5 chapters that connect, and what we see in many of them is going back to what Viredo described, but others have also described it as life is mutual aid. And Ramose writes in his chapter all the different, and he mentions all kind of different languages in which you have the same kind of expression, the importance of mutual aid, which is a deep African philosophical meaning. But we should not underestimate the role of food in that. The fact that you help each other is also when someone is hungry or when someone is in need, you share food. And that is precisely where these chapters focus on. Beatriz Uchera Manu, who is Ghanaian but currently located in South Africa, wrote this chapter on Akan ethics and says like these ethics of mutual aid can actually address the challenges of what we call subsistence farming in Africa. Other reconstructive insights, Charles Dewa is a scholar in Zimbabwe, and he is actually affiliated with the AFSA, the Alliance for Food Sovereignty that I just mentioned. And through that network, he has been able to study markets, mass food markets at different African huge cities in different countries. And he has been interviewing people on those markets and then analyzing that from an African philosophical point of view by identifying African values that underpin these markets. And that comes to the conclusion that these are between competition and mutual aid. Petronella Chaminuka, a scholar from Zimbabwe currently working in South Africa at the ARC, Agricultural Research Center. And I did a study together on cattle keeping through Ubuntu philosophy, where we had conversation with Songhai people in Limpopo province. And we engaged in conversations through cattle, through Ubuntu philosophy and through proverbs. So that is very different from how a livestock scientist would usually engage in conversations and do interviews. And it gave us also very different results than we had expected. And as a teaser, both of us have been working with cattle and livestock in Africa for more than 12 years. We did our PhDs. We thought we knew pretty much everything there is to know about livestock. But once you start talking through proverbs and through Ubuntu, the conversation unfolds completely differently. And there's such a wealth of knowledge that we learned from these conversations. It was very, very beautiful. And it illustrated how important it is to really try and understand different epistemologies. And then Diana Abasi Ibanga, who's located in Nigeria, wrote a chapter on food and interspecies relations, where he dived into food ethics and environmental values. And he used a lot of proverbs, and this is also one of the proverbs that he has, that you see there, that he has been using in his chapter to illustrate the relations between food, the environment, and animals and plants. And the fifth chapter that has reconstructed insight goes to Ghana. Here we collaborated with a whole group of colleagues who are part of the Center for Indigenous Knowledge and Organizational Development in Ghana. And they've been working for a long time on endogenous development, which means they're working from within in a community. They start first with what is the knowledge that is there on their agricultural systems. And based on that, we can still accept influences from outside or Western knowledge, but first let's see what is from within. And they've built their own organization already, I think now for 10 or 15 years on indigenous knowledge and development. And then we have two chapters that have more intercultural responses. The first one is largely conducted by Sally Diop, who was a previous student from Wageningen and plant scientist. And she interviewed African philosophers. I think Oyeshile was one of them. I think Pius was one of them a long time ago. And she interviewed Wageningen food system thinkers. And by doing that, she was able to bring the thinking of these food system thinkers and African philosophers in an intercultural dialogue. And that is actually quite a deep chapter to unravel the thinking. Where do we meet? Where do we not meet? Where do we diverge? So it's an attempt, again, in this epistemic diversity. And then chapter 10 is a critical dialogical approach to developing the leaders in African food systems, which is written by the colleagues located in South Africa, Ralph Haman, Busiso Moyo, Scott Dreamy, and Laura Pereira. And they actually have written a chapter based on trainings that have been developed for the future leaders of food systems in Africa. So Wageningen has been developing trainings for the so-called leaders in food systems in Africa. So a lot of African scholars from Kenya or South Africa would be given that training. And they have been reflecting on that through a dialogical approach on how, because if you want to change or transform the food system, you need leaders. Who are then the future leaders and what kind of training do they get? And that brings me to almost the end, and I'm going to keep it short, which is difficult because the final two chapters are by Ramosa, and you can never shorten Ramosa if you know him. So what he does is he closes the book with two chapters that are really a philosophical reflection on the chapters that we had so far. In the first chapter, 11, he is titled Our Daily Bread Through Agriculture and Development, the Voice of Ubuntu. And the key question he asks is, what does give us our daily bread really mean when for at least 92 years, agriculture worldwide has managed to overproduce food to feed everyone on Mother Earth daily, yet there are billions, the bottom billion, who are hungry and starve daily. That is the question that he is addressing in that chapter 11. And he continues in chapter 12 because he gives an Ubuntu response to give us our daily bread. And there he asks, will a change of prayer from our Father to our Mother deliver the conquered indigenous people from the deadly clasp of undeserved hunger? That brings me to the end of this book. This is the book. I have two more remarks to make. One is a disappointment because the book is not yet available. It was supposed to be available end of October, but Springer is taking some time. But it will, because it's already announced, it will get there. Then the good news, and I have to be grateful to my own university here, because it will be published open access. So once it's there, all of you and everywhere across the globe, you can download all the chapters in PDF or the entire book, and I hope including the artworks. And that's it for my part. And then I would like to say thank you and invite Prof. Oyeshile to come for his part. But for now, thank you for listening.
Good evening, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and the organizers of this event. I will only take 5 minutes. This is my second adventure to the Netherlands. The first one was brought about by Tim Mayers, and now Dr. Vega, second time. I'm happy to meet great people here. Pius, my friend from 2010, I brought him to Ibadan. And then my brother, Professor Akinrade, is with us here at African Studies Center. Now, what does the book focus on? It's food for thought. Now, we can see the centering of knowledge, epistemic pluralism, and decolonization in all aspects of African food system. And let me just give the key highlights so that, because it's a continuous thing, centering knowledge concerning food because of the European hegemonic order. So we can list the following as the main messages of the book. Now, first, the book is meant to address the injustice in food systems, especially as it concerns Africa. 2, the book addresses hegemonic imposition of Europe on other food systems, and Africa is also included. And the book calls for intercultural, interdisciplinary approaches towards food systems, especially in Africa. And it also reiterates the need for epistemic justice in the agricultural sectors, especially in Africa too. Epistemic justice, because sometimes when new knowledge on agriculture or food system comes out, it's also within the framework of Europe, European epistemic framework. And we have seen that that does a lot of injustice to the African society. The book also emphasizes the comprehensive nature, the complementary nature of food system. We have to support each other. It's not as if we versus them or they versus us. We have to work in such a complementary fashion that everybody contributes to the table and make the food system a better one. And again, the book, for instance, the book frowns at the destruction of subsistence farming in favor of commercial farming based on Eurocentric Western concentration, which leads to another form of injustice. You just discover that in many parts of Africa, the subsistence farming is being eroded, not because of shortage of food, but because of what we call agricultural production and increase in capital. But you also discover that the kind of seeds that are sent to Africa at times, GMO seeds, you cannot replace them. Once you grow and you harvest, I think that becomes the end. Unlike what Africans were doing in the past, that they can replant a particular seed, because if you really depend on a body to provide seed for you, and that body says no, you are at the mercy of the person, and that can lead to the collapse of the system. So what we are saying is that subsistence farming is not something you can just eradicate, because you have to study the value system of the people and why they still hold on to it. And that is not a barrier against commercial farming. So what we are saying is that even when you preach commercial farming, it should be in tandem with the beliefs and aspirations of the people. Lastly, there's a call for critical and inclusive dialogue in African food system. Critical and inclusive. Not must we criticize, but we must see how we can come together to provide a viable alternative. And there are general dimensions to this edited book written by tested hands, such as Mugobe Ramose, and scholars with deep knowledge of their cultural practice. Now you can see now that somebody who has PhD in agriculture is now applying philosophical theories to this, and you can imagine how rich such a work is. It's not that they are doing a kind of armchair work where they will sit in a room and say everything about what happens in the field. They have seen it, they have had practical experiences, and I think that is very good for philosophy and any other form of scholarship, because we must speak with the people, not about the people only. We must speak with them, we must get involved. And that's when our philosophical disputations, disquisitions, and so on and so forth can really impact the life of people. Therefore, the book addresses not only food issues and politics, but also values, justice, and environment. We talk about food. Food is life, so it's very crucial. And there are so many dimensions to food: values, justice, environment. And the book has, because I read the manuscript, the book has taken care of this. And lastly, the book is a practical demonstration that African philosophy is a lived experience, as it inputs everyday experience, such as food, in its many dimensions, to the growth of individual cultures, nations, and world generally. So it is a practical demonstration, because practical demonstration in the sense that if we don't grapple with what happens to the people, then our theorization or scholarship may just be floating. But this book has brought knowledge to the pedestal, brought knowledge home to everybody, and it makes the book more accessible. Thank you very much.